In 1971, in a quiet New Jersey suburb, something unthinkable happened inside a large Victorian mansion. The house stood silent for weeks, untouched and undisturbed. But inside, something was terribly wrong. Religious hymns played on a loop through a speaker system, filling the empty halls with eerie echoes. Photographs of a seemingly happy American family were scattered throughout the house, but in every one of them, the father's face had been cut out. That man was John Emil List, and by the time anyone realized what had happened, he had vanished without a trace. John was born in 1925 in Bay City, Michigan. He was an only child, raised in a strict Lutheran household by deeply religious parents. He was quiet, obedient, and disciplined, a boy who found comfort in routine and faith. When World War II broke out, John enlisted in the Army and served as a lab technician. After the war, he took advantage of the GI Bill and earned degrees in business and accounting from the University of Michigan. But when the Korean War began, John was recalled to active duty. It was during this time that he met Helen Taylor, a widow whose first husband had died in combat. They married in 1951, and John adopted her daughter from the previous marriage. Together, they had 3 children, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick. Patricia was the oldest. She loved theater and dreamed of becoming an actress, a dream that her father strongly disapproved of. He believed it was morally inappropriate and sinful. Patricia was outgoing and passionate, but she often clashed with her father over her interests and behavior. John Jr., on the other hand, was athletic and studious. He played soccer and tried hard to live up to his father's strict standards, always seeking his approval. Frederick, the youngest, was quiet and bookish. He had a calm nature and was very attached to his siblings. All 3 children were raised in a deeply religious household. They attended Sunday school and youth groups, and to outsiders, they appeared to be a well-behaved, devout family. But inside the home, they lived under their father's heavy rules and high expectations. Over the years, John moved his family from state to state as he climbed the corporate ladder. By 1965, he had landed a prestigious role as vice president and chief accountant at a bank in New Jersey. With this success, he purchased a grand 19-room mansion called Breeze Knoll in the upscale town of Westfield. He even brought his elderly mother, Alma, to live with them. To the outside world, John's life was the picture of success: a beautiful home, a devoted wife, 4 children, and strong ties to the church. He was active in the community, taught Sunday school, and led a Boy Scout troop. He was always polite and proper, so proper, in fact, that he wore a tie even when mowing the lawn. But beneath the surface, John was under immense pressure. Helen had contracted syphilis from her previous husband and never told John. The illness took a toll on her both physically and mentally. She became increasingly withdrawn, suffering from headaches and depression, and turned to alcohol to cope. John had to take over the household duties in secret, while trying to maintain the image of a stable, successful man. Helen no longer attended church, which deeply disturbed John. He saw her absence from worship as a sign of moral decay, a threat to the family's spiritual future. She would even mock John in public, comparing him unfavorably to her first husband, a humiliation that further shattered John's pride. By 1971, things had spiraled out of control. John had lost his job at the bank but told no one. Every day, he dressed in his suit, picked up his briefcase, and left the house as if going to work. But instead, he spent his days sitting at the train station, reading newspapers, pretending to be employed. Meanwhile, the bills were piling up. He was more than $11,000 behind on the mortgage, an enormous sum at the time, worth around $88,000 today. He took out a second mortgage, but it wasn't enough. His pride would not allow him to ask for help or apply for welfare. To John, doing so would bring shame to his family and tarnish the reputation he had built. As the financial strain grew worse, so did his emotional and mental state. He believed he had failed, not just as a provider, but as a spiritual leader. In his mind, losing the family home and turning to welfare were not just signs of failure, they were sins. He became convinced that his family was heading toward ruin, both materially and spiritually. Helen's illness and behavior only deepened that fear. Her drinking, her disrespect, her rejection of church, they all confirmed to John that her soul was in danger. During the early 1970s, John List's children began to embrace the freedoms of the changing times, freedoms that made their conservative father deeply uncomfortable. His daughter Patricia had developed a strong passion for acting in theater, something John believed was morally inappropriate. He feared that her involvement in the arts would lead her away from the Christian faith and, worse, influence her younger brothers in the same direction. Whispers soon spread that Patricia had been researching witchcraft, possibly for school, or perhaps out of personal curiosity. To John, this wasn't just teenage rebellion, it was spiritual danger. He confronted Patricia about her interests, and grew increasingly fixated on her behavior. Once, when he caught her smoking, he exploded with anger. From her modern clothes to the music she listened to, everything about Patricia seemed like a symbol of moral decay. John felt powerless as the moral foundation of his family seemed to crumble around him. Even the family could sense the growing tension. In a chilling moment, Patricia reportedly told a teacher, perhaps half-jokingly, that she thought her father might kill them all. Tragically, her words would soon prove to be true. By this time, John had already begun to consider a horrifying solution. He believed his family was slipping away from the religious and moral values he held sacred, and he began to see death as the only way to save them. A psychiatrist would later describe John's mindset as rigid and deeply disturbed, but John believed he was acting with clarity and purpose. He convinced himself that God would understand his actions and even forgive him. In his mind, this was not murder, it was salvation. John carefully planned every detail. He informed the children's schools and employers that the family would be away visiting relatives. He canceled all deliveries to the house, including milk, newspapers, and mail. He even made sure Helen's mother wouldn't be visiting as expected. By early November 1971, his plan was in place, and the house was prepared. On the morning of Tuesday, November 9, 1971, John woke early and went about his morning as if it were a normal day. He helped his children get ready for school and sent them off as usual. Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick left the house, completely unaware of the horror their father had planned. Once the house fell silent, John went to the garage and retrieved 2 handguns, a 9mm semi-automatic pistol and a .22 caliber revolver. His first target was his wife, Helen, who sat in the kitchen sipping her morning coffee. Approaching her from behind, John raised the pistol and shot her in the side of the head. Blood splattered across the table as Helen collapsed and died instantly. John then walked upstairs to the 3rd floor, where his elderly mother Alma was preparing breakfast in her private apartment. Without saying a word, he raised the revolver and shot her above the left eye. She died instantly in her chair. He gently placed a cloth over her wound, later saying he killed her to spare her the shock of what was to come. John then dragged Helen's body into the mansion's ballroom and tried to move Alma's, but she was too heavy, so he left her upstairs. He cleaned up the blood from the kitchen, disposed of the spent casings, and then sat down to eat lunch, at the very table where he had just murdered his wife. The chilling calmness in his behavior was disturbing. Now, with the 2 adult women dead, John waited for the children to return home. That afternoon, Patricia was the first to arrive. She walked in through the front door, and before she could say a word, John raised his pistol and shot her in the head. He dragged her body into the ballroom, placing it next to her mother. A short time later, young Frederick returned. He met the same fate. John shot him quickly and carried his small body into the ballroom as well. John Jr., the eldest son, had a football match after school. In a haunting move, John drove to the school and watched the game from the sidelines, knowing that his wife, daughter, youngest son, and mother were already dead at home. After the game, he offered John Jr. a ride. They returned to the house together, and once inside, John once again raised his pistol. Unlike the others, John Jr. didn't die right away. Evidence of a struggle was found, suggesting he may have fought back. John fired multiple times, eventually shooting his son in the chest and face until he stopped moving. Then he added his body to the growing row in the ballroom. By 5 p.m. that evening, John List had murdered all 5 members of his family. He arranged the bodies on sleeping bags under a stained glass skylight in the mansion's ballroom. The scene resembled a morbid family tableau, a grim display beneath a Tiffany-designed window that depicted the resurrection. To John, this was symbolic. He then turned the thermostat down to slow decomposition, switched on the intercom system to play religious music on a loop, and turned off all the lights. He sat down and wrote a 5-page letter to his pastor, explaining everything. In the letter, he claimed his family had lost their faith and were becoming morally corrupt. He said he couldn't bear to let them experience the shame of financial ruin and believed he had saved them from damnation. Before signing off, he asked for forgiveness and stated his plan to disappear without a trace. After writing his confession letter, John List carefully signed it and left it on his desk. He then went through the entire 19-bedroom mansion and removed every single photograph that included his image. Using scissors, he cut his face out of each one, erasing all traces of himself. This was a calculated move. He didn't want the police to have an accurate photo of what he looked like. Some believe that John left the house immediately after the murders. However, others think he may have stayed one last night in the home, with the bodies of his family still inside. Before disappearing, he quietly withdrew money from his mother's bank accounts and packed a few belongings. He drove the family car to JFK Airport in New York, parked it in long-term parking to mislead the authorities, and then vanished. He never boarded a flight. Instead, he took a train and disappeared into the night. By the time police found the bodies, nearly a month had passed, and John List was already gone. For almost 4 weeks, no one realized anything was wrong. John had planned every detail. He canceled deliveries and services so that nothing would pile up at the door. He told the children's schools and part-time jobs that the family was going away to visit a sick relative. Inside the mansion, lights were set on timers, turning on and off at scheduled times to give the appearance of normal life. Neighbors believed the family was away. But in reality, the bodies were still inside, undisturbed and slowly decaying. Eventually, the light bulbs began to burn out one by one. Still, no one checked the house. One of Patricia's drama teachers grew concerned when her calls to the home went unanswered. By early December, neighbors also became suspicious, noticing the family had been gone for too long. They contacted the police. On December 17, 1971, officers arrived to perform a welfare check. The doors were locked, but one officer crawled through an open basement window. Inside, the house was freezing cold. As he moved through the dark rooms, he heard soft organ music playing through the speakers, an eerie sound in such a grim setting. Then came the smell of decay, thick and overwhelming. In the mansion's ballroom, the police found the bodies of Helen, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick, each lying on a sleeping bag with a single gunshot wound to the head. Upstairs, they found John's mother Alma, dead in her apartment. A note left by John asked the police not to disturb anything and to contact the family's pastor. What followed would become one of the most extensive fugitive investigations of the decade. The FBI soon joined the case and traced John's last known movements to JFK Airport. There, they found the family car abandoned, confirming it had been left there to throw off the investigation. John left behind no paper trail, no credit card activity, no job applications, no clues. The only images investigators had of him were from an old passport and a faded high school yearbook photo. With very little to go on, they issued wanted posters nationwide. Tips poured in, but none led to him. Eventually, the case went cold. Over time, the FBI compiled 10 full volumes of leads and sightings. Some believed he had fled to Canada. Others thought he was living as a drifter in California. One person even suggested he might be the infamous hijacker D.B. Cooper, though that theory was later dismissed. In reality, John had started a new life. After leaving New York, he traveled to Michigan and eventually settled in Colorado. By early 1972, he had taken on a new identity, Robert Clark. He worked as a cook in the Denver area before moving into central Denver, where he found a job as a tax preparer. He became active in a local Lutheran church and even volunteered to drive elderly members to services. He kept quiet about his past and lived a seemingly peaceful life. In 1977, during a church picnic, he met a woman named Dolores. The two began dating, and by 1985, they were married. They moved to Virginia, and John told Dolores that his first wife had died from cancer. She had no idea who he really was. But the truth would eventually come out. In 1989, 17.5 years after the murders, America's Most Wanted aired a special episode about the John List case. A forensic artist named Frank Bender created a clay sculpture of what John might look like in the present day. Despite having very few photos to work from, the bust was incredibly accurate, even capturing his thick glasses and receding hairline. The image was broadcast to millions. Over 200 tips came in. Most of them were dead ends. But one tip stood out. A woman named Wanda Flannery recognized the bust immediately. She had lived next to a man in Denver named Robert Clark, but she knew him simply as Bob. Though she didn't know where he had moved, her tip gave investigators the break they had waited for nearly 2 decades. The FBI soon tracked him down. Less than 2 weeks after the episode aired, on June 1, 1989, the FBI and local police arrived at a quiet accounting office in Virginia. It was there that John List, living under the name Robert Clark, was finally arrested without resistance. At the time of his arrest, List didn't admit who he really was. He calmly insisted he was Robert Clark and claimed it was a case of mistaken identity. But the investigators had come prepared. They took his fingerprints and quickly compared them to those from his military records. The match was undeniable. Robert Clark was, in fact, John List. Confronted with the evidence, John eventually admitted his true identity. He was extradited back to New Jersey, where he would finally face justice for the murders he committed nearly 18 years earlier. In August of 1989, a Union County grand jury indicted John List on 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for each victim: his wife, his mother, and his 3 children. John pleaded not guilty, and his trial began in early 1990. By this time, he was a soft-spoken, 64-year-old man, still a former Sunday school teacher, but now accused of killing his entire family. The case immediately drew intense media attention. The defense didn't deny that John committed the murders. His written confession made it impossible to argue otherwise. Instead, they claimed he was not mentally well. His attorneys argued that John suffered from a mental disorder that made him incapable of understanding right from wrong at the time of the killings. A court-appointed psychiatrist testified that John had obsessive-compulsive disorder, which made him extremely rigid and unable to cope with stress. According to this expert, John's strict religious beliefs, his personality disorder, and his fear of financial ruin created a psychological trap. He believed he had no other way out. The defense claimed he was not a violent man by nature but a broken man who snapped under pressure. They pointed to his law-abiding history and deep religious faith to support their claim. However, the prosecution strongly disagreed. They argued that John knew exactly what he was doing. They emphasized the careful planning behind the murders and how coldly he carried them out. He shot each victim, often from behind and without warning. He spent weeks preparing, canceled deliveries, closed bank accounts, and set up light timers to make the house look lived in. After the murders, he even attended his son's soccer game as if nothing had happened. These were not the actions of someone in a psychotic state. They were signs of clear, calculated decision-making. The most powerful piece of evidence came from John himself, the confession letter he had left for his pastor. In it, he explained in great detail why he had killed his family. He wrote about financial troubles, his fear of moral decline in the household, and his belief that he was saving his loved ones from eternal damnation. "I killed them to save them from evil," he wrote. The letter proved that the murders were premeditated and purposeful. After 9 days of testimony, the jury reached its decision. They found John List sane and guilty on all 5 counts of first-degree murder. On April 12, 1990, he was convicted. The next day, during sentencing, John finally broke his long silence. He gave a short statement saying he was sorry for what had happened but stopped short of taking full responsibility. The judge was not moved. He handed down the maximum sentence, 5 consecutive life terms in prison, making John List ineligible for parole. At 64 years old, John was led away in handcuffs to begin a life behind bars. Justice had finally caught up with him. Over the years, John gave a few interviews from prison. He claimed to feel regret and said he prayed for forgiveness daily, but he never expressed true remorse for the lives he had taken. He explained that he never killed himself because suicide was a sin and would have barred him from heaven. In his mind, by staying alive and repenting, he could still reunite with his family in the afterlife. This twisted reasoning revealed the same warped mindset that led him to murder them in the first place. Even decades later, John remained calm and rational in interviews. To many, he still looked like a mild-mannered accountant, not the man who had wiped out an entire family. The town of Westfield never forgot the horror. In 1972, the mansion where the murders took place was destroyed by a suspicious fire. Though the cause was never officially proven, many believed it was no accident. The house was later demolished due to damage and disrepair. A new home was built on the land, but the property remained haunted by its dark history. John List's story became a major case in true crime circles. Books, documentaries, and fictionalized films were inspired by what he had done. Psychologists used his case to explain a disturbing phenomenon: the family annihilator, usually a father who kills his entire family in a twisted act of control and destruction. John List died in prison in 2008 from pneumonia. He was 82 years old. Until the end, he never fully accepted responsibility. He never apologized to extended family members. He seemed to believe that what he did was necessary, and that someday, he would be forgiven. But for the rest of the world, John List remained a symbol of cold, calculated evil, a man who chose murder over facing his failures.